My name is Renee Callahan, and I was 34 years old, a licensed estate paralegal with 11 years of document work behind me, the kind of woman who could read a trust instrument the way other people read a menu. And still I sat in my car in my father's driveway on the 23rd of December and let him tell me my children were not welcome at his table. My daughter was 6. My son was 4. They were buckled in the back seat with their coats still on, and they had no idea what their grandfather had just said to me at the front door. I had one document in my bag. I had been carrying it for 11 months. I did not take it out that night. I drove home on Route 9 through Harlow County, the heater blowing loud, the kids asleep before we reached the Millbrook Road overpass, and I held the wheel with both hands, and I did not cry. I understood, even then, that the document in my bag was more patient than I would ever need to be. Welcome back to Channel, where the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who already know how it ends. I grew up in Cedar Falls, a small town in the western part of the state where everybody's last name was on something: a road, a church pew, a scholarship fund at the county high school. The Callahan name was on the Callahan Lumber Endowment at Cedar Falls Community College, started by my grandfather, a man named Gerald Callahan, who had built a mid-sized timber operation from nothing and sold it in 1987 for what was, at the time, a serious sum. He retired to a white house on Fenwick Lane with my grandmother, Eleanor, and spent the last 20 years of his life doing woodworking in the garage and eating dinner at 6 o'clock every night without fail. I was close to Gerald. My brother, Davis, was close to my father. That is, in one sentence, the entire architecture of everything that followed. My father, Robert Callahan, was the younger of Gerald's 2 sons. He had been passed over for the lumber business. His older brother took that, ran it competently, sold it alongside Gerald, and so my father had built his identity around being the family's social anchor instead. He organized the Christmas gatherings. He decided who sat where at Easter. He curated the Callahan family story the way a docent curates a museum, and he had, over 30 years, quietly shifted every room in that story so that he and Davis's family stood at the center of it. I had watched this happen the way you watch water find a drain. Slowly, then all at once. My mother went along with it. She was not a cruel woman. She was a tired one, which is sometimes the same thing, and she had learned decades ago that disagreeing with my father cost more than it returned. I had married at 28, a good man named Patrick who worked in civil surveying out of the Harlow County Municipal Office. We had Lily in year 2 and Owen in year 4, and when we brought them to family events, my father's effect toward them was never hostile. It was simply and precisely less. Less eye contact. Less of his chair turned toward them. Less of his names spoken with warmth. He called Davis's children, Bryce and Cora, by their names constantly, spontaneously, in the middle of sentences about other things. He called my children the little ones, even when he was standing directly in front of them. Patrick noticed before I said anything. He mentioned it one Sunday in October, driving home from a birthday dinner for my father at the Sutter Grill on Main, and I said, "I know," and we drove the rest of the way in silence because there was nothing useful left to add. My grandfather noticed too. I believe he had been noticing for years. Gerald had a wooden box. He kept it on the workbench in his garage, the second shelf from the top, pushed back against the pegboard wall where his chisels hung. It was about the size of a shoebox, made from burled walnut he had milled himself sometime in the 70s, with a small brass latch that had gone green at the edges. He had never told me what was inside it. But every time I visited him, and I visited often, especially after Patrick and I had the kids, he would glance at that box at some point in the conversation. Not dramatically. Just a look. The way you check on something you're not ready to open yet. I remember one Saturday afternoon in the spring, about 3 years before all of this, when I had stopped by with Owen, who was not yet 2, and had fallen asleep in the car on the drive over. I carried him in and set him on the old wool blanket Gerald kept folded on the garage couch, and Gerald and I sat and drank coffee and listened to the radio while Owen slept. Gerald had been working on a small cabinet, tight mortise and tenon joints, the kind of joinery that takes years to make look effortless, and he set his tools down when I came in and didn't pick them back up. "How's your father?" he asked. "He's fine," I said. "And Patrick?" "Good. He's bidding on the Harlow County Watershed Survey. Could be a year of work." Gerald nodded. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had spent his life making things, scarred along the knuckles and stained faintly with finish. "You're doing well," he said. It was not a question. "We're doing fine," I said. He looked at me for a moment, the way he did sometimes, level and unhurried, and then he picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything else. But I saw his eyes go to the box on the second shelf, just for a second, before he looked back at me. "You're patient," he said. "You always were." I didn't know what he meant. I do now. There was another afternoon I think about, in the winter before Gerald got sick, when I stopped by after dropping Lily at the Early Learning Center. It was a Wednesday about 7 in the morning, and the garage was cold enough that Gerald had the kerosene heater going in the corner. He was working on a rocking chair, the runners sanded but not yet varnished, and he was bent over a clamp checking the joint with a patient. Unhurried attention he brought to everything that required precision. I stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard me. He was talking to himself, very quietly, not words I could make out, just the low murmur of a man reviewing his own work. He looked up when I knocked on the frame, and his face did the thing it always did when I came. It settled, the way a room settles when you open a window. "Early start," he said. "Lily's at school," I said. "I thought I'd come by, before work." He poured me a coffee from the thermos on the shelf, the thermos with the dented side that my grandmother had been trying to replace for 15 years, and we stood in the cold garage, and he showed me the joint he was checking, the precise fit of the tenon and the mortise, the way a good joint needed no filler, no compensation, just two things made right enough that they held by their own geometry. "That's the whole job," he said. "Make it right. Then it holds." I looked at the rocking chair. I looked at the box on the shelf above it. "What's in the box?" I said. He looked at it. He took a sip of his coffee. "Things I'm keeping track of," he said. He didn't say anything else, and I didn't ask again. "Some things you carry, because you're waiting for the right moment." That box was one of them. My document was another. I had first seen the document 11 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, when Gerald's estate attorney, a woman named Margaret Purcell at Purcell and Sloan on Elm Street in Harlow County, had called me into her office for what she described as a preliminary review. I knew Margaret professionally. I had processed filings through her office twice in the previous 3 years, and when she slid the folder across her desk and I opened it and read the first 2 pages, my hands went very still on the table. It was Gerald's revised will. He had amended it 14 months prior, quietly, through Margaret's office, without telling my father. The document was specific, detailed, and irrevocable. I am not going to describe every line of it here, but I will tell you that when I closed the folder and looked up at Margaret across the desk, I understood 2 things simultaneously. Gerald had seen everything my father had done, and Gerald had already answered it. "How long has this been ready?" I asked. 14 months, Margaret said. He came in on a Tuesday, same as he always did. Sat in that chair. She looked at the chair across from her desk, the one I was sitting in. He went through it paragraph by paragraph. Wanted to make sure every word said what he meant it to say. And he didn't tell my father. "He told me," she said, "that the people who needed to know already knew." I looked at the folder. "He left instructions about timing," she said. He was specific. He said the presentation of the document should be at your discretion. Not mine. Not the court's. Yours. Margaret told me Gerald wanted me to hold a certified copy. She told me the timing of its presentation was, per Gerald's written instruction, to be determined by me. I took the folder home. I put it in the fireproof box in our bedroom closet, behind Patrick's surveying certifications and Lily's birth certificate and the deed to our house on Millbrook Road. And I did not tell my father. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell Davis. I went about my life. I took Lily to her Tuesday and Thursday sessions at the Sutter Falls Early Learning Center on Grove Avenue for 6 months, holding her hand in the parking lot each morning, watching her run toward the door. I drove Owen to his speech therapy appointments at the Harlow County Pediatric Clinic on 7th Street every other Wednesday for 4 months, sitting in the waiting room with a coffee going cold in my hand, listening to him practice his consonants through the door. I kept my files at work. Answer my father's calls. I showed up at Easter with a dish to pass and sat where I was told to sit and smiled when I was supposed to smile. I went into the Harlow County probate clerk's office on a Thursday in March and filed a routine transfer document for client, and I stood at the counter and thought about Gerald standing at a counter very much like this one, handing over the amended will without ceremony, without announcement, just a man making sure a piece of paper was in the right place. I drove Owen to speech therapy on the first Wednesday of April, and the third Wednesday of April, and the first Wednesday of May, and I sat in the waiting room with my work files on my lap because there was always something to file, always something to review, and I thought about patience the way you think about a tool you are not ready to use yet, but keep sharp anyway. I attended my father's birthday dinner at the Sutter Grill in June and sat at the far end of the table with Patrick while Davis made the toast, and my father laughed at Davis's jokes and called Bryce and Cora over to tell them something about the summer plans. I ate my food. I drove home. I tucked the kids in. I sat with a glass of water in the kitchen for a few minutes after Patrick had gone to bed, listening to the house settle. I kept my own counsel for 11 months, and it cost me exactly what I expected it to cost, and I paid it every day without complaint because Gerald had trusted me with something that required that price. In August, I drove Lily to a Thursday session at the Early Learning Center and stayed in the parking lot for 10 minutes after she went inside, watching the other parents pull out, their cars vanishing one by one down Grove Avenue, and I sat with the engine off and the morning heat building against the windshield. I thought about the folder in the fireproof box at home. I thought about Gerald at his workbench, checking the joint, the particular quality of attention he gave to things that needed to hold. I started the car and drove to work. I filed 3 documents for a trust modification at the Harlow County Courthouse. I ate lunch at my desk. I drove back to pick up Lily at noon and she came through the door at a run, both braids coming loose, and she said, "Mama, I made a bird," and I said, "Let me see it," and she opened both hands to show me a small folded piece of blue construction paper, and I said, "It's a very good bird," and she said, "I know," with the serene certainty of a child who is not yet old enough to be modest. That was a Thursday in August. There were months of Thursdays before New Year's. For 11 months, I carried that document. I let my father be exactly who he was. I let him seat Davis's children at the main table and suggest, every single time, that Lily and Owen might be more comfortable with the cousins in the back room. I let him tell me, at Thanksgiving, that the Christmas gathering this year would be smaller, more intentional, which was his way of saying what he said to me at the door on December 23rd. He had come out onto the porch when he heard the car. He had a mug in one hand and the particular expression he wore when he was about to disappoint someone and intended to make it sound like logistics. He said the gathering was smaller this year, more intentional. He said Davis's children were already settled in. He said it would be better if I and the kids headed home and they would do something separately after the New Year. I said, "You're telling me my children can't come to Christmas dinner?" He said, "I'm telling you this particular dinner isn't set up for it." And he picked up his mug and looked at me the way he had always looked at me when he considered something settled, and went back inside. That evening, after I put the kids to bed, I went to the closet and took the fireproof box off the shelf. I opened it in the kitchen under the overhead light, and I took the folder out and I set it on the table, and I sat with it for a long time without opening it. I thought about Gerald's wooden box on the shelf in the garage. I thought about how he had looked at it, just glanced at it, once or twice, the way you check on something you're not ready to open yet. I thought, I am ready now. I did not open the folder that night. I just set my hand flat on the cover and felt the paper beneath my palm, the small weight of 11 months, the specific gravity of being patient when patience is the hardest thing. Patrick came in from the living room and saw me sitting there. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. "New Year's," I said. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "You sure?" he said. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Just be there," I said. He nodded. He reached across the table and set his hand flat on mine on top of the folder, and we sat like that for a moment, his hand over mine over the paper, the overhead light very bright and very still. He sat down across from me, and we drank our tea, and neither of us said anything else, because there was nothing else to say. New Year's Day fell on a Thursday that year, and my father called at 8:14 in the morning to confirm we were coming to dinner. "Eleanor's doing a full spread," he said. 2:00. "Don't be late." "We'll be there," I said. I had the folder in my bag. I had called Margaret Purcell the week before and told her the timing. She had said, "I'll be available by phone if needed," and left it at that. The document was certified, notarized, and had been on file with the county probate office for 14 months. There was nothing left to prepare. Patrick drove. The kids sat in the back with their good clothes on. Owen in the small navy blazer my mother had sent for Christmas, Lily with her hair in 2 braids she had asked me to do twice because the first ones weren't even. The roads through Harlow County were clear and gray, the fields on either side of Route 9 flattened by frost, a low sky the color of old dishwater pressing down on everything. "Mama," Lily said from the back seat, "is Grandpa Gerald going to be there?" "No, sweetheart," I said. "Grandpa Gerald passed away. This is Grandma Eleanor's house." "But it was his house too," she said. "It was," I said. "It still has his things in it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I liked his garage. It smelled like wood." I turned toward the window, so she wouldn't see my face. "It did," I said. "It smelled exactly like that." My stomach was tight the whole drive. Not from fear. From the particular tension of knowing exactly what is about to happen and having to wait for it anyway. My parents' house on Fenwick Lane was full when we arrived. Davis and his wife, Carla, were already there with Bryce and Cora. My mother's sister, Aunt Ruth, had driven up from the county south. 2 of my father's golf friends, men named Tom Eberly and Phil Dracer, were in the living room with drinks. My grandmother Eleanor was in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the counter with the focused quiet of a woman who has fed large rooms for 50 years and finds the work calming. She looked up when I came through the kitchen door. Her eyes went to my bag. She knew. She had known since Margaret called her in November. Gerald had made sure of it. She said, "Renee, honey," and touched my arm once, and then turned back to the stove. I set my bag on the bench in the mudroom, under my coat. I left it there. I was not going to take it out until the right moment, and the right moment had not come yet. In the living room, Davis was showing Tom Eberly something on his phone. Bryce and Cora were on the rug near the fireplace with a game they'd brought. Cora looked up when Lily came in and said, "Do you want to play?" And Lily looked at me and I nodded. And she sat down beside Cora and picked up one of the game pieces and turned it over in her hands with the concentrated interest she brought to everything new. Owen had found a wooden coaster on the coffee table and was stacking it experimentally on top of a small hardcover book, testing whether the 2 objects could balance. My mother came out of the kitchen drying her hands on a towel. She kissed my cheek. Her eyes were careful, the way they always were when she was holding something she wasn't sure how to hold. "How are the roads?" she said. "Clear," I said. "Cold." "I'm glad you made it," she said, and I knew she meant more than the drive, and I squeezed her hand once and let it go. Dinner was set for 2 o'clock, but we didn't sit until 2:30. My father arranged the seating the way he always did, Davis and Carlo on his left, Bryce and Cora between them, and my mother at the foot, Ruth beside my mother, Tom Eberly and Phil Dracer filling the middle. Patrick and I were placed at the far end, beside the door to the kitchen, the seats that were fractionally removed from the center of the room in a way that was just barely deniable. There was no chair set for Lily. I stood at the table and counted. 12 chairs. 13 people. Patrick put his hand on my shoulder blade, one flat palm, and didn't move it. "Dad," I said, "there's no chair for Lily." My father looked at the table as though he were seeing it for the first time. "Oh," he said. "Well, there's the kids set up in the back room. I thought the little ones would enjoy that." "Lily is 6, I said. "She can sit at the table." "Of course she can," he said, in the voice he used when he was agreeing with something he had no intention of changing. "It's just that we're a little tight this year, with Tom and Phil here. I thought it'd be cozier for them in back." A silence settled over the table, like a cloth being laid flat. I looked at Bryce and Cora, who were 9 and 11 and seated without comment at the main table, and I said nothing. Patrick pulled a chair from the side wall and placed it at the end of the table next to me, angling it in, and Lily sat down in it and unfolded her napkin in her lap the way I had shown her, and my father watched this happen and said nothing further. The meal started well enough. My mother had made the green bean dish that everyone asked for. Ruth was telling a story about her neighbor's dog. Phil Dracer was talking to Tom Eberly about a course renovation down in the county south. The room had the particular warm noise of a family that, from the outside, appeared to be functioning. Ruth had gotten everyone's attention with her story about the neighbor's dog. It involved a stolen garden gnome and the fire station 2 towns over, and had already made my mother laugh twice, the kind of laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes, the laugh she used to have more of before the years of managing my father's arrangements had smoothed it down. Davis was smiling. Even Tom Eberly had turned from his conversation with Phil Dracer to listen. Cora and Lily were both watching Ruth with the particular focus children give to adult storytellers who don't talk down to them. Owen had eaten half his green beans and was working on the other half with systematic attention. For a few minutes the table was just a table. Warm food, a funny story, people who knew each other gathered in a room that had fed them for years. I looked at the faces around it. I looked at my children's faces in the middle of those faces, taking up space, eating food, existing without apology, and I thought, this is what it is supposed to look like. They had always deserved to be in this room. They had always been in this room. The question was only ever whether anyone was going to acknowledge it. Then my father looked down the table at Owen. Owen had knocked his water glass, not over, just sideways, the base lifting and setting down again with a small clunk, and water sloshed toward the edge of the placemat. "Careful," my father said. Not warmly. "He's 4, Patrick said, reaching across to steady the glass. "I know how old he is," my father said. "I'm just saying careful." The room went quieter around that exchange, the way rooms do when something has been said that everyone heard but no one wants to name. Owen looked at his plate. His small shoulders came up toward his ears and didn't go back down. I put my hand on his knee under the table. I didn't say anything. Lily, beside me, had gone very still. She picked up her fork. She looked at her food. She was 6, and she knew something had happened that she didn't have the vocabulary for, but she was her father's daughter and her grandfather's granddaughter, and she did not make a scene. She just ate her food and talked to Cora when Cora spoke to her, and kept her elbows off the table because she always kept her elbows off the table, and she was not going to stop now. After the plates were cleared, my father stood at the head of the table with his wine and gave the small speech he gave every year about family, about the Callahan name, about the year ahead. He named Davis. He named Carla. He named Bryce and Cora by name. He said, "The rest of you," once, gesturing loosely toward our end of the table, and moved on. Patrick's jaw went tight. I felt it without looking at him. I kept my face still. The gifts were done by 4 o'clock. My father had coordinated them, as he always did. Bryce and Cora had envelopes. I didn't see the amounts, but I saw the thickness of them. Lily and Owen had small wrapped packages, books, the kind of generic gift that signals the buyer did not think long about it. Lily opened hers carefully, peeling the tape rather than tearing, the way she always did. She held the book up and said, "Thank you, Grandpa," clearly and without prompting. My father said, "Sure, honey," and was already looking back at Davis. The skin along my collarbone tightened like a cord being pulled. I breathed through it. Owen tore his open with both hands and held up his book and turned to me with his face wide open, looking for my reaction before he decided what his own was. I smiled at him. "What do you think?" I said. He looked at the book. He turned it over. He said, "It's a book about trucks," with the seriousness of a 4-year-old who is weighing this information. I like trucks, he decided, and held it to his chest. At 4:40, while Carla and Ruth were washing up and Patrick had taken the kids to the back room to run off energy, my father sat down beside me on the living room couch. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," I said. "I know you were bothered about the chair situation earlier," he said. "But you have to understand, Renee, we had extra guests this year, and it's not practical to rearrange everything just because my children are at the table?" I said. "I didn't say that." "You seated 11 people, including 2 children," I said. "You left out 1. I just want to understand the math." "It wasn't about math," he said, and his voice had the particular quality it got when he believed he was being reasonable in the face of someone else's unreasonableness. "It was about what was comfortable and practical. Bryce and Cora are older. They sit better. They're used to adult conversation. Lily and Owen are at a different stage. They're your grandchildren, I said. All 4 of them are my grandchildren, he said. The word all landed like a stone dropped into water, and neither of us said anything while the rings of it spread outward. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from where I was sitting. You know, he said after a moment, Davis has worked very hard to build something stable for his family. Carla's parents are involved. There's a lot of continuity there. I'm not saying your situation is bad, Renee. I'm just saying it's different. I looked at him. Patrick's a good man, he said. But surveying is surveying. You've always been, you know. You've always done things the harder way. Another silence opened between us. This one had a different texture. I just think, he said, that you should be realistic about what the family dynamic is. Davis carries a lot of this. He's the one who comes to everything, who stays involved, who keeps things going. I'm not saying you don't matter. I'm saying there's a responsibility dynamic that just... Dad, I said. He stopped. I'm going to get my bag, I said. I stood up. I walked to the mudroom. I felt the tile under my shoes, the cold coming off the outside door, the smell of wet wool from the coats on the hooks. I reached under my coat on the bench and lifted my bag by the strap and felt the weight of the folder inside it. I walked back to the living room. I set the bag on the coffee table. My mother had come in from the kitchen and was standing in the doorway. Eleanor had come from the hall. Davis looked up from the armchair where he'd been on his phone. I did not hurry. I set the bag flat on the table and reached in with both hands and took out the folder. I placed it on the coffee table. I sat back down. Grandpa Gerald left a revised will, I said. Margaret Purcell filed it with a Harlow County probate office 14 months ago. I've been holding a certified copy since January. My father looked at the folder. He did not touch it. That's not, he started. It's certified, I said. You can call Margaret's office. She's available. The room had gone completely still. Tom, Eberly, and Phil Dracer had stopped talking in the other room. I could hear Owen's voice from the back of the house, a small bright sound, telling Lily something about a toy. My father reached out and opened the folder. He read the first page. His face did not change expression immediately. It did the thing faces do when information arrives that the brain is refusing, a kind of blankness, a suspension, like a clock that has lost power but whose hands haven't moved yet. Then he turned to the second page. The color in his neck changed. Not all at once. Slowly, a tide going out, leaving the skin the specific gray-white of something that has been wet for too long. He set the page down. He said nothing. Eleanor, my grandmother, stood in the hallway doorway with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she watched her son read his father's last answer to 30 years of a question, and her face was the face of a woman who had been waiting a long time for something to be said that she could not say herself. My mother was looking at her hands. Davis was looking at the folder. Nobody spoke. I went to the back room and stood in the doorway and watched Lily and Owen on the rug with the building blocks Patrick had found in the toy box. Owen had stacked 4 blocks into a tower and was considering a 5th. Lily was narrating the project in a low, patient voice the way she did when she was trying to help without taking over. Patrick looked up at me from where he was crouched beside them. I nodded once. He stood up slowly. I turned back toward the living room. I reached into my bag and took the folder back out. I unfolded the top cover. I laid it flat on the table. I reached into the folder's interior pocket and took out the second document, the one Margaret had prepared for this moment, and I placed it beside the first. I sat down. My father was still looking at the pages. I waited. My father had not moved. The 2 documents lay side by side on the coffee table, the certified will and the secondary instrument Margaret had prepared, their edges aligned, the paper very white under the living room lamp. The room had the quality of a held breath, not dramatic, not loud, just the specific stillness of a moment that has been a long time arriving and now is simply here. Davis was still in the armchair. He had put his phone down. His eyes were moving across the pages from across the room, trying to read them at a distance, and I could see the moment he gave up trying to be casual about it, leaned forward, and read the first paragraph clearly. His face did something I had not expected. It didn't harden. It just emptied. The way a room looks after the furniture has been moved out. My mother had sat down on the far end of the couch. She was holding her own hands in her lap, her fingers wrapped around each other, and she was looking at the floor between the coffee table and the window. Eleanor had not moved from the doorway. I looked at my father. He looked up from the pages and he looked at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something dismissive, something that reframed the moment in a way that put him back at the center of it. He was good at that. He had been doing it for 30 years.
But he didn't speak.
He just looked at me, and I saw something cross his face that I had never seen there before, something that sat beneath the usual architecture of his confidence, something old and undefended, and then he looked back down at the pages. I let the silence be what it was. Davis sat forward in the armchair, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling, and then looked at me. He'd amended it 14 months ago, Davis said. Yes, I said. Davis was quiet for a moment. He came to my office Christmas before last, he said. Said he was thinking about making some changes. I thought he meant the workshop equipment. He looked at the folder. He didn't say anything else about it. I assumed he stopped. Nobody finished the sentence for him. My mother looked up from her hands. Her eyes were dry, and she was holding herself very carefully, the way she had held herself for 30 years of family dinners where the seating was arranged to say something nobody was willing to say out loud.
Gerald told me, she said.
My father looked at her. He called me last spring, she said. He said he'd made the changes. He said I should know. She looked at her hands again. I didn't tell you, she said to my father. He asked me not to. The room absorbed this. My father sat with the pages in his hands and did not speak. The lamp above the coffee table made the paper very white and the room very quiet. The will itself was 4 pages. Gerald had been precise, the way men of his generation were precise when they wanted something to be unmistakable. The language was clean and specific, drafted by Margaret Purcell with the kind of clarity that does not leave room for interpretation. The estate was divided. Gerald had left the house on Fenwick Lane to Eleanor outright, in her name alone, with a life estate provision that specified she could remain there without condition for the remainder of her life. Upon her passing, the house would transfer to me. The Timber Trust, a modest vehicle Gerald had maintained since the sale of the business, currently holding a principal of $4.3 million, was divided as follows: 40% to Davis, 40% to me, and 20% held in a named educational subtrust designated specifically for Lily and Owen Callahan Marsh, to be administered by Margaret Purcell's office until the children turned 22. The administration fee for the subtrust, set at $2,750 annually, was drawn from the trust principal and covered the cost of annual reporting and disbursement review. My father received the contents of the workshop, the tools, the woodworking equipment, the burled walnut box on the second shelf of the garage, which was listed by name in a separate handwritten codicil Gerald had attached to the back of the will. Gerald had also written a letter. It was paper-clipped to the inside back cover of the folder. It was addressed to no one in particular. It was written in his handwriting, which was the careful, slightly slanted print of a man who had taught himself penmanship from a book. I had read it once, in Margaret's office in January, and I had not read it again since. I did not need to. I had it word for word in the part of my memory where things go when they matter too much to risk forgetting. He had written, "The children at the far end of the table see everything. They remember everything. Make sure they know they were worth remembering." My father looked up from the will. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet, "You've been holding this since January." "Yes," I said. "And you didn't say anything." "No," I said. He started.
He stopped.
He pressed his lips together. "That's not how this family does things, Renee." I reached into the folder. I took out the letter. I unfolded it slowly, the single crease opening flat, Gerald's handwriting coming visible in the lamplight, line by line. I laid it flat on the table beside the will. I looked at my father, and I said, "You told me tonight that Davis carries the family. That's what you said. Davis carries this." He said nothing. "You told me that my situation is different." "Those were your words, it's different." His jaw moved. He did not speak. And you told me that Lily and Owen are at a different stage, that they sit differently, that they're not ready for the adult table. The room was absolutely still. I picked up the folder and the letter and the certified copy of the will, and I stacked them in order, and I slid them back into the folder, and I closed it, and I stood up. I did not slam the folder on the table. I did not raise my voice. I set the folder in my bag, and I lifted the bag by its strap, and I turned toward the hallway. I did not slam anything on my way out. Eleanor stopped me in the hall. She put one hand on my arm, just briefly, and she said, "He knew, Renee. He always knew." I nodded. She squeezed my arm once and let me go. The back room was warm. Owen had gotten his 5th block onto the tower and was eyeing a 6th with the seriousness of a structural engineer. Lily was sitting cross-legged beside him, narrating quietly. Patrick was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and when I came in he looked at my face and then at my bag, and then he said simply, "Done?" "Done," I said. Owen looked up from his tower. "Mama, I made it 6, he said. "I see that," I said. "That's very tall." "It might fall," he said. "It might," I said. "But it's standing right now." He considered this with great seriousness, decided it was satisfactory, and reached for a 7th block. We gathered our coats from the mudroom. I did not go back into the living room. Patrick carried Owen, who had decided his legs were too tired, and Lily walked beside me with her hand in mine, her other hand carrying the book she'd been given, the generic one, holding it with the same care she gave everything. The cold outside hit us like a door opening inward. The sky had gone dark while we were inside, a full winter dark, the kind that happens fast in January when the light gives up early and doesn't apologize for it. The porch lamp made a yellow circle on the front step. Our car was at the end of the driveway. I buckled Owen into his seat. I helped Lily with her seatbelt. Patrick started the engine and the heater came on and the windows fogged at the edges, and the familiar smell of the car, coffee and the small cedar air freshener Lily had picked at a gas station the previous summer, settled around us. We pulled out of Fenwick Lane and turned onto Millbrook Road, and I watched my father's house go small in the side mirror and then disappear behind the tree line. Neither Patrick nor I said anything for a long time. Lily said from the back seat, "Mama, was Grandpa Gerald nice?" "Yes," I said. "He was very nice." "Do you miss him?" The question sat in the warm car like something delicate. My throat tightened, a small fist closing once and releasing. "Yes," I said. "Every day." "Me too," she said, though she had only met him a handful of times before he passed, and what she was missing was probably more the idea of him than the man himself. The workshop smell, the way he called her the engineer because she liked to stack things. But I didn't correct her. Some things you don't correct. Owen had fallen asleep before we reached the Millbrook Road overpass, his head tipped sideways against the window, the book about trucks held loosely in both hands. Lily looked out her own window at the dark fields on either side of Route 9, the frost-flattened grass catching the last blue of the evening sky, and she was quiet in the way she was sometimes quiet, not sad, just thinking, processing whatever her 6-year-old mind was making of the day. I watched her in the rear-view mirror. She caught my eye and gave me a small smile and looked back out the window. Patrick reached over and put his hand on mine on the center console. We drove the rest of the way home without speaking, the heater steady, the road empty ahead of us, the document in my bag on the back seat quiet and done. Margaret Purcell called on the 3rd of January, a Tuesday, at 9:22 in the morning. She said my father had contacted her office. She said she had explained to him that the will was filed, certified, and not subject to contest under any grounds she could identify. She said he had then asked if there was any provision for, and here she quoted him, the ongoing management relationship between the family and the estate. She said she had told him there was not. She said he had thanked her and ended the call. I thanked Margaret. I ended my call. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and I looked at the fireproof box, which was back on its shelf in the bedroom closet, now empty of the folder, and I thought about Gerald and his workshop on Fenwick Lane, looking at the burled walnut box on the second shelf of the pegboard wall. He had made that box himself. He had put something in it and latched it and left it there. He had looked at it once or twice, in the middle of conversations about other things. Not dramatically. Just a look. The way you check on something you're not ready to open yet. I thought about what it costs a person to be patient. Not passive, patient. To carry a thing without opening it because the moment hasn't come. To watch a room rearrange itself around an injustice and to know, without being able to prove it yet, that the room is not the truth of things. Gerald had done that for decades. He had watched my father manage the family story, assign the seating, name the children who mattered, and let the others be the little ones. And Gerald had said almost nothing. He had just looked at his box. And waited. And then, when the moment was right, he had spoken. Not loudly. Not with drama. He had filed a document with Margaret Purcell's office, in the Harlow County probate system, on a Tuesday, and he had clipped a letter to the inside back cover, and he had waited for someone to read it. The children at the far end of the table see everything. They remember everything. Make sure they know they were worth remembering. I opened my laptop. I had work to do. Davis called on the 7th of January.
He was civil.
He said he didn't blame me. He said he knew I hadn't engineered it, that it was Dad, that this had been building for years. He said he was sorry about Christmas and about the chair. I said I appreciated him saying that. He said, Dad's pretty shaken. I said, I know. He said, I think he thought it would all just go to him. The house, the trust, the whole thing. I said, I think so too. There was a pause. He's not a bad person, Davis said. I know he's not. I said, and I meant it. Bad people are easy.
My father was not a bad person.
He was a man who had spent so long managing the story of his own importance that he had stopped being able to see what the management was costing everyone around him, including himself. That is not evil. It is something sadder than evil. It is just a kind of long, slow shrinking. Are you going to be okay? Davis asked. Yeah, I said. We're going to be fine. There was another pause, and then Davis said, I want you to know I didn't know about the will.
I want to be clear about that.
I know, I said. And I think what Grandpa did was right, he said. It sounded like it cost him something to say. The kids. The subtrust for Lily and Owen. That was right. Davis, I said.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said again. Okay. Take care of yourself. My father called on the 12th. He didn't apologize, not directly. He said he had been thinking. He said he realized some things could have been handled differently. He said Christmas had gotten away from everyone a little bit. I listened. He said, I'd like Lily and Owen to come to Easter. They'll be there, I said. A pause. Good, he said. Good. He was quieter than usual. Not broken. I don't want to overstate it. He was not a man who broke easily, and I was not looking for that. I was looking for what I heard in his voice, which was the particular quality of a man who has discovered, at 64, that the story he has been telling about himself for 30 years had a different ending than the one he planned. That is not a small thing to discover. It is not a comfortable thing. I did not need him to suffer. I just needed the room to tell the truth. The burled walnut box arrived at our house on the 22nd of January, delivered by Eleanor herself, driven over from Fenwick Lane in her car on a Tuesday afternoon. She set it on our kitchen table while the kids were at school and Patrick was at work. She sat across from me and had a cup of tea while I undid the brass latch. Inside was Gerald's work. Not money, not documents, but the real work, the thing he had actually made with his hands. There were small carved pieces, a set of them, each one with a child's name on the bottom in Gerald's careful print. Lily. Owen.
Bryce. Cora.
Mine was at the bottom. He had made mine first. It was the most worn. Eleanor watched me take it out and turn it over in my hands. She said, he made those the year each one was born. He said it was so he'd remember to look at them. I set mine on the table. The wood was smooth and warm and smelled, faintly, of the workshop. He made one for you too, Eleanor said. Before any of the grandchildren. He made yours first. What does that mean? I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. It means he'd been watching for a long time, she said. And he wanted to make sure he remembered. I held it and did not say anything. Some things you don't need to put into words. That is not avoidance. That is just the limit of what words can do, and the wisdom to know it. Easter came. Lily and Owen sat at the main table. My father pulled Owen's chair in himself, carefully, making sure the legs were even on the floor. He used Owen's name 3 times without being prompted. It was not a transformation. I am not going to tell you it was. It was a beginning, small, slightly awkward, the way all real beginnings are. But it was real. I sat in my chair and ate my mother's green bean dish and watched my children exist, unapologetically, in the room where they had always belonged. That was enough. There is a kind of patience that people mistake for weakness. They see a quiet person and they think, nothing is happening there. They see someone who doesn't argue, doesn't escalate, doesn't perform their injury for a watching room, and they think, she doesn't know. She doesn't see it. She'll accept whatever she's given. What they don't understand is that patience is not the absence of knowing. It is knowing, clearly, completely, and choosing to wait for the moment when knowing becomes undeniable. My grandfather understood this. He built something careful and irrefutable in Margaret Purcell's office, and he left it for the right moment. He carried his box on a shelf and looked at it once in a while, not dramatically, just a look, and waited. I am my grandfather's granddaughter. That is the thing my father forgot. That's my story. I drove home from my father's house on Fenwick Lane on a December night with my children asleep in the back seat, a document in my bag that I had been carrying for 11 months, and both hands on the wheel of a car on Route 9 through Harlow County. I sat in a living room on New Year's Day and laid a folder flat on a coffee table and said 3 things my father had already said to me. And I stood in a back room and watched my 4-year-old boy decide that a tower standing was enough, even if it might fall. If you've been sitting at the far end of a table that was set without you in mind, if you've been carrying something patient and heavy and have not yet found the right moment, take this as your sign. You don't have to be loud. You just have to be ready. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. If this story landed for you, drop a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next one.